We are here to stand firm in our commitment to work for the fundamental civil rights of women and to end racism, misogyny, and LGBTQIA phobia. These goals have been at the heart of the Women's March movement since its inception in January 2017. Since that time, we have seen a rise in awareness of the deep need to advance gender equality, minority rights, reproductive freedom, economic justice, racial justice, and criminal justice. We have been heartened and strengthened by marching beside one another year after year, and by coming together regardless of faith, race, sexual identity and preference, religious and cultural background, or political affiliation. For us here at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, these values speak to the heart of who we are at our core. As Jews, our people's foundational story is that of redemption from slavery. We are obligated to fight for freedom and for whose rights are rejected or subverted. The history of the Jewish people is one that is marked by facing prejudice and peril. We have been the stranger, the downtrodden, the weak, and the abused. And so we are obligated to fight for freedom and fair treatment of the weakest and most powerless among us. Our Jewish, American, and basic human values demand this of us. For over 100 years, Stephen Wise Free Synagogue has been at the forefront of the struggle to help make the world a better place. We believe that religious values like justice, compassion, and kindness must be brought into public discourse to inspire moral and ethical action in broader society. After November of 2016, we sensed that new and growing moral challenges to American society were emerging. Our deep concern about the treatment of immigrants and refugees, and ongoing protection of basic civil liberties, and worries that anti-Semitism would reemerge led us to establish 3 new social justice task forces: immigration and refugees, civil liberties, and anti-Semitism. And these task forces, along with our Social Action Committee, have led to over 1,000 people engaging in acts of social justice work through Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. Over the past 2 years, with great passion and a deep sense of obligation, our members have taken part in the Women's March each year. However, we have been deeply dismayed and disheartened by the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist rhetoric associated with the founding leaders at the helm of the Women's March, Inc. They have damaged the beauty of the message of unity and equality at the heart of the Women's March movement. We are deeply grateful that there are alternatives to Women's March, Inc., such as Women's March Alliance and Zioness, that more closely reflect our core values while continuing to empower us to fight for women's rights, gender equality, and other issues that are so dear to us. We are feminists and we are Zionists. And these parts of our identities live in concert and strengthen one another. We seek to be in broad coalitions such as this as we work towards a more just and equal society. We are heartened to find so many allies, both from within and from outside the Jewish community. Women's March Alliance and Zioness better represent the values we support while allowing us to remain true to our core beliefs and our identities as liberal Zionist Jews. We are thrilled to be here together with these inspiring organizations and with all of you. And I want to extend a heartfelt appreciation for joining us and for all that you do from our senior rabbi, Amiel Hirsch, who regrettably could not be here tonight. And now I invite to join with me on the bima we welcome our panelists, Amanda Berman, founder of Zioness, who will be moderating this teach-in. Catherine Semienko, founder of the Women's March Alliance. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, lead sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment. Melanie Robbins, Deputy Director of the Anti-Defamation League of New York and New Jersey. Mohammed Rashid, founder of Smart Academia. Rabbi Robin Fryer Bodzin, National Co-Chair of Rabbis Against Gun Violence and a Rabbi Without Borders Fellow. Sulma Arzu Brown, Women's March Alliance Board Member. Tyler Gregory, Executive Director of A Wider Bridge. And Jennifer Raj Kumar, Special Counsel and Director of Immigration Affairs at the New York Department of State. Thank you.
And let's take a quick picture with Carolyn, Congresswoman. Yeah, let's take a quick picture with the Congresswoman. Okay, so I guess. There we go. Windows. Thank you to everyone who's in charge. Okay. We're good? Okay. This is incredible. Thank you all so much for being here. I can't tell you how much it means. We are so excited to have this really important conversation, and to have it at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue is an extra special treat. Of course, considering the history of the synagogue and of Stephen Wise and of commitment to progressive values, and it is my distinct honor to introduce Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. I'm going to say a couple of things about you. Congresswoman Maloney is the first woman to represent New York's 12th Congressional District, the first woman to represent New York City's 7th Councilmanic District, where she was the first woman to give birth while in office. She was the first woman to chair the Joint Economic Committee, a House and Senate panel that examines and addresses the nation's most pressing economic needs. A champion for domestic and international issues, Representative Maloney has authored and helped pass legislation that targets sex trafficking, including the first bill that focused on the demand side of human trafficking to punish the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. She is co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Human Trafficking and co-chair of the Trafficking Task Force of the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. During her first term in Congress, Congresswoman Maloney passed legislation that provides annual mammograms for women on Medicare. Her legislation to create women's health offices in 5 federal agencies was part of the landmark healthcare reform legislation, the Affordable Care Act, thank you, signed by President Obama. She also authored the Debbie Smith Act, which increases funding for law enforcement to process DNA rape kits and has been called the most important anti-rape legislation in history. Congresswoman Maloney, we could talk for many hours about what an ally you have been to women and to the Jewish community. You are a Zioness in every sense. I want to thank you for being here, for standing with us, for standing for all of the right things all the time. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm so absolutely delighted to be here. I just got off the train coming back from Washington, where there's a great deal of excitement with the new Democratic majority. We flipped 40 seats from Republican to Democratic and elected a really landmark number of women. More than 100 women will be joining Congress, and I think that's really good for the country. And we hope to see a lot of progress and movement forward in so many ways. But tonight I want to thank Zioness for inviting me to be part of this event and part of this incredible panel that you have. And I just appreciate very much being included. We need to reward leaders that are bringing people together, that are including everyone, all communities, LGBTQ, all races, all ethnics, all religions. No one should be shunned or not included. I don't understand it. We have so much energy and so much positive things that are happening, but I will share with you that I have been stunned by the resurgence of anti-Semitism around the country, from vandalism at cemeteries, which I represent, synagogues and Jewish day schools, the terrifying march of white nationalists in Charlottesville, to the devastating, heartbreaking murders in Pittsburgh. It has been disheartening to hear Minister Farrakhan continue to spew anti-Semitic filth, words that should be easy to condemn. Against that backdrop, it is critically important for the Women's March to be a welcoming event that embodies inclusiveness for everyone. The Jewish community has been a very important part of the women's movement, and without question should be embraced by the Women's March. It is shocking to many of us that this has not been the case. Tonight's discussion will be an opportunity for us all to learn how to ensure that everyone feels welcome. The Women's March is an event that is meant to be uplifting to women and like-minded men and all of us who want to fight against bigotry and hate. I am so proud that the Women's March Alliance, a separate and independent group responsible for New York's Women's March, has made clear that they do not stand by the equivocation of the national organization and have worked to make sure all feel welcomed at their events, which is evidenced by their partnership tonight in tonight's event. I have worked with Catherine Simioko in the past, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that she is the real deal. She worked hard in the past 2 years to make the New York March an incredible success. And the first march that we had right after the inauguration, I went to it and we thought that we would have 20,000 people. And that day we had the largest march in the whole country. Over 700,000, according to the police, came out for that incredible march. And I have marched in both previous women's marches and plan to be attending the 3rd annual march organized by Women's March Alliance this coming Saturday. I think everyone should march. To me, this demonstration has come to symbolize strength, hope, and community. The strength of people who believe in a more equitable world where women are treated equally and where we will finally pass and ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. I must tell you, the Women's March had many positive effects. It's really spurred the Me Too movement, which has brought great change on harassment, the Time's Up movement. It was a moving force behind the energy, behind so many women candidates and led to so many being elected, which I think is going to be a positive voice for families' issues and for justice in Washington. And it has been an incredible push forward for the Equal Rights Amendment. When I went to Congress, I had a list of 10 things I wanted to accomplish that seemed impossible. I've accomplished all of them, even building the 2nd Avenue subway. Applaud, that's a great thing. But I have not been able to move the Equal Rights Amendment until the Women's March and the Me Too movement. And then, as you remember from history, it passed in 1972. It had a deadline of 7 years. We reached that deadline, 35 states ratified. And then we did another extension for 3 more years. They still didn't reach that deadline. But Nevada ratified just last year, Illinois ratified, and just last week in the great state of Virginia, they passed out the amendment and ratified it in the House, in the Senate rather, and now they're waiting to ratify it in the Senate. So we're coming very, very close. So we are introducing next week 2 bills. One is by Jackie Spear, which would lift the deadline. This will no doubt be challenged. It'll go to the Supreme Court. And we will claim that it's ratified. We finally got 38 states. But if they don't ratify it, we're reintroducing the whole amendment again and moving forward. And I just want to give you 2 examples why it's so important. One of the first bills that I worked on when I first came to Congress was the Violence Against Women Act, which really recognized in law the sexual assault, the violence against women in domestic and other areas. But this bill expires every 5 years. Well, I would say violence and domestic violence against women shouldn't ever expire. It should be protected. It should be in the Constitution. This is serious stuff. And so we shouldn't be dependent on the whims of who's in the White House or who's in Congress or who's on the Supreme Court. Something as fundamental as women's equality should be in the Constitution. Now, as Scalia famously said, and he said, he was a strict constitutionalist, and he said, regardless of what I believe, if a discrimination case came to me against women, I would determine and rule against them because they're not in the Constitution. Well, let's put women in the Constitution. And I have passed more bills in my lifetime on equal pay for equal work. The problem is you can't enforce it. But with a constitutional amendment, it is enforceable, the laws of the land, equal pay for equal work. So this is something worth fighting for. I would say everyone should be supporting equality, and everybody should believe in equality. And equality means inclusion and fair treatment to men and women and everyone else. And I would like to see the Women's March, not just march, but really stand for the goals of peace and stability and inclusion and harmony and family of a country together, and finally passing and ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. So I really want to thank everybody for being here. I have a lot more to say, but I think you've got a panel here and you've got to get going on with it. But I've got to tell you that I wanted to really thank all of the people that are here, part of this coalition that has come together tonight to support the Zionist principles and the Zionist a belief that we should all include everyone. I want to be part of an inclusive effort. I have great respect, and I'm deeply grateful to my friends in the Jewish community because they've always stood for the right things. They've always stood to help people, to help other people, to help the community, and to be part of what's positive in this country. So I want to thank you for coming and allowing me to speak. I am going to go home and get ready for my hearing tomorrow, press conference, meetings, and everything else. So if you'll excuse me, I wish I could stay, but I thank you for having me, and I'll be marching with you on Saturday. It's important that we all get out and march for peace, justice, inclusion, Israel, faith, everything that's positive, and the Equal Rights Amendment. Thank you very much.
I mean, is she the best? Yes, the answer is yes. Okay, so I'm just going to frame this conversation for 2 minutes. We have so many amazing people to hear from right now. I think you all know what Zioness is, but just in case someone is here and doesn't, Zioness is a new movement that is working to empower and activate the vast majority of American Jews who are deeply committed both to our progressive values and our Zionist identities. We are standing up to the suggestion that somehow Zionism is divorceable from what it means to be a Jew. It is not. And when we are targeted in progressive spaces because of our commitment to a safe and secure Jewish state, it is anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism has reared its head in the Washington, D.C. Women's March. It's really important that we all understand that there are local marches with leaders like Catherine and Freedom and all the other people here in New York with the Women's March Alliance, and in Los Angeles with Emiliana Gareca, and in Mercy Morganfield in Washington, D.C. They were both at our teach-ins in L.A. and D.C. earlier this week. There are extraordinary women out there who are working to unite the feminist movement, behind the right issues, behind equal pay and reproductive rights and equality, child care, health care, and people like Catherine and Freedom are doing this work, and we need to understand how important it is that we reclaim our seats at the feminist and progressive tables as proud, committed Jewish Zionists. So we need to build back relationships with other communities. We need to stand proudly, not just for ourselves, but for others. That's what it means to be a Jew, to commit yourself to Tikkun Olam, to working to advance progressive values across the board. And so I really could not be more proud or grateful to these amazing group of people, these incredible panelists who are all going to tell their own stories, why they're here, what they do, and why this conversation is so important to them. After that, we're going to take some questions. Quentin is going to hand out note cards. Quentin is here. If anyone needs a note card, just raise your hand. He'll be walking around. And the reason we are not having a more public question and answer is just to save time. I wish we had many hours for this, but I know everyone has work to do, and we have a march to prepare for. So let's get started with Councilmember Richie Torres.
Just say anything? I will speak briefly because there seems to be as many panelists here as there are candidates for public advocates. So it's quite. I'll share a quick story. I had a friend who took enormous pride in his Jewish identity and took enormous pride in the state of Israel. But he said to me he avoids expressing his opinion on Israel or on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within progressive circles for fear of ostracism. And that comment lodged in the back of my mind because, for me, what could be more progressive than supporting a sanctuary for historically oppressed people? Right? What could be more progressive than supporting the sole symbol of liberal democracy in one of the most authoritarian and volatile regions in the world? But, and it was sad because if those of us who support Israel censor ourselves, then we're ceding the terms of debate to the BDS movement. Right? We're giving permission to the BDS movement to define what it means to be progressive, right? To declare that you cannot be both Zionist and progressive. And I, for one, refuse to cede the terms of debate to this BDS movement. Right? Criticism of a country is one thing. It's fair game. Right? There is often criticism of American foreign policy, but no one questions America's right to exist. Right? No one questions America's right to defend itself. Right? Those criticisms are uniquely leveled against Israel. And if there's concern about human rights abuses, why is there no BDS movement against Saudi Arabia for murdering Jamal Khashoggi or contributing to famine in Yemen? Or why is there no BDS movement against Russia for invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea, or Myanmar for ethnic cleansing against Muslims? What if it's not anti-Semitism, what is driving the obsession with Israel? One of the best definitions of fanaticism that I've heard was from Winston Churchill, who said that a fanatic can't change his opinion and won't change the subject. And the fanatics of the BDS movement refuse to change the subject from Israel. There's an obsession with Israel as though it were the root of all evil. And I think we should call it for what it is. It is anti-Semitic at its core. And I worry that it is gaining a real foothold of power in academia. Not so much among millennials, but they call it Generation Z. And there's a real foothold in I would say, there are two factions on the left, right? There's the progressive faction, and now I think increasingly we're seeing the emergence of a democratic socialist faction. And the platform of the Democratic Socialists of America explicitly embraces the BDS movement as a core plank of its platform. And so the question I have is, what implications will that have for the BDS movement within left-wing circles? Is the BDS movement going to move from the fringe to a position of greater power and prominence? So I do worry about the future, and I feel like those of us who call ourselves supporters of Israel cannot afford to be complacent, cannot afford to censor ourselves. We have to resist, we have to fight back. And that's why I'm proud to be here. Okay. Oh, I should identify that I'm a New York City council member. So, and I have been to Israel twice, including once during the 70th anniversary. And it was one of the most formative experiences of my life, to go to Masada, to go to Yad Vashem, and to understand the historical rationale for the state of Israel. It's a gift that keeps on giving, and I'm immensely grateful for it. And I'm immensely grateful to JCRC for making that trip possible. And in the city council, I chair the committee on investigations, so I'm not the mayor's favorite council member. So.
I'm going to be extremely short because I imagine that there'll be a lot of questions for the Women's March Alliance. I'm Catherine Simianko, and I'm the founder and president of Women's March Alliance here in New York. I'm also going to be brief because I'm feeling particularly emotional when I look around this room. It's dawned on me that I've never known Jews to quit. You are incredibly strong, community-oriented people. And your voice must be heard on Saturday. You cannot hide. Come out and stand for Jewish communities. Stand against anti-Semitism, because I'm going to be there standing against it for you. That's all I got to say. I'm getting emotional.
Shalom. My name is Zioness. And your name is Zionist to each of you. Zionist carries big heart, the heart of gold. Every time when people press Zionists to go down, they make history. They get Nobel Prize. They bring finest hospitals. Who says the earth, the air, the water, the sky is not for them? Who says a land is not for them? Who says the country is not for them? They are for the whole world. They bring the peace. They bring the harmony. They bring friendship. They show caring and sharing. Go back to Quran, go back to Torah, go back to any book and see the history. How Moses bought this world pieces, how Harun bought this world pieces, you know. A tiny country, lives near the sea with no resources, became the one of the mightiest and the strongest country in the world. You denied that country a country, and you say you have no right to live? No, sir. America is a country where big-hearted people lives, and we live here. We are American. We stand with the Zionists. We stand with each Jewish people. When each Jewish people cries, we cry. We are with you all the time, from day one to day, last day in our life. Thank you for giving the opportunity to speak.
I'm Rabbi Melinda Zalma. I am a chaplain in the Navy Reserve component. And I work for the JCRC of New York, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, and currently, well, what I like to say is what I do for my work is I bring together people of diverse backgrounds and faiths to listen generously to each other, to have open curiosity about the other, and to honor each other's dignity inherent in each one of us. Currently, I'm doing that through bringing women together of different faith backgrounds and different cultures and professions, and uniting over our commonalities, but honoring our differences. And that, for me, relates back to my core belief and connection to Israel. I first went to Israel when I was a teenager, and I will never forget praying Mincha, the afternoon service, in Jerusalem in the Old City. And as I was praying to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, I felt myself connected through the ground to my ancestors, my parents, my grandparents, their parents, all the way back to the people in whose name I was praying. And I was hooked. And I said, I know I need to come back here and not just visit, but to live here. Because even then I had the sense of how complicated Israel was. and how beautiful the diversity could be. So I went back after college and lived there for 2 years. And when I was there, I made sure to listen carefully to many different people. I was impressed with all the different Jews from so many different places in the world. I went to different synagogues, from Greek synagogues to Bukharian to ultra-Orthodox to the progressive, just marveling and reveling in the diversity of the Jewish community. But I also knew that there were more than Jews living in Israel. And during my first few weeks there in Ulpan, the intensive Hebrew course, there were 2 young Arabs there, Muslims, who lived in Bethlehem. And one day we played hooky from Ulpan, and we went to the Old City. And I listened to them about what their life was like and their connection to the land. And on the beach in Haifa with my Israeli cousin, we met a young man who was the headmaster of a Christian school in Nazareth, who invited me to their opening. So I spent time listening to Arab Christians. And I spent time going to Palestinian and Israeli dialogues. And then I also spent time with my boyfriend in the settlements, taking the bus through Arab towns to the settlements and learning why were they there, what were they connected to. I was trying to open myself up to the complexity of Israel and trying to listen with open curiosity and with generosity and honoring the dignity of others. And that, I think, in this conversation, in the conversation around the Women's March, in the conversation around can you be progressive and believe in Israel's right to exist, we're all human beings, and we're complicated. And there's no litmus test for having certain values. There actually might be people who have very social-oriented values who might completely disagree with you on a very completely opposite. Like, maybe they disagree with you about abortion, but agree with you in single-payer health care. But we need to stop and listen to each other and remember that at our core, no matter how much we disagree and how many differences we all have inherent human dignity given to us by the fact of us being born. In Judaism, we talk about B'Tselem Elohim, being created in the image of God. Doesn't matter who you vote for, you're still created in the image of God. Doesn't matter what you believe about this political issue or that. We're all created in the image of God.
Good evening. My name is Jennifer Rajkumar. My parents immigrated here from India in the 70s. My mom was born in a mud hut. They came here with $300 in a suitcase, and I was born and raised in the United States. And there's not a day that goes by that I'm not grateful for that fact. And coming from this background, when I look at the Jewish community, I realize that the struggle of the Jewish people is a fundamentally American story. And coming from this background, I've decided to dedicate my life to social justice work. And as I did that, my Jewish brothers and sisters were hand in hand with me in nearly every progressive fight. So when I was on the litigation team on behalf of 5,000 women, fighting for equal pay and equal rights for women and against pregnancy discrimination, it was with my Jewish brothers and sisters that we waged this battle. I work with ADL, who we have a representative on this panel today, all the time when it comes to immigration projects for the state of New York. And there has been almost no better partner than the Anti-Defamation League. So at every point, it's my Jewish brothers and sisters that have been with me during these battles. And on this panel, my brother Mohammed Rashid, who when the tragic synagogue shooting occurred in Pittsburgh, we had an event with 400 Bangladeshi Americans in Queens, primarily Muslim, and together we sculpted a prayer for this, to commemorate this tragic incident. So I'm here because, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, when all that tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. So I decided at this moment, with the alarming rise of anti-Semitism, this is not a moment where I could be silent. It was said again by Elie Wiesel, who said that the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. So this was not a time that I could be indifferent. So I will be proudly marching with the Alliance, and I will be hand in hand with all of you and standing up, because there really is no other option. Neutrality is not an option right now. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Freedom Shannon. I am on the board for the Women's March Alliance here in New York. I am sitting here, thank you, and I am sitting here because of November 8th, 2016. I remember waking up and thinking, I don't live in the same world I lived in the day before. That I 100% took it for granted. I 100% believed that the person who was best equipped for the job, who had the experience, who had the education, who had the background, was rightfully going to get the job they deserved, and it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? When you ask people, they said, I just don't like her. Just don't like her. There was no other reason other than I just don't like her. And I look at these shirts that are in front of me of turning outrage into outcome, and that's how I felt. I felt like when we look back on history, I want to know that I was standing on the right side of history, that I didn't become complacent, because I think that's what also happened. You had a lot of people, and I will put myself in that boat of thinking, we're in New York, she's going to win, it's not going to be an issue, and it didn't happen. The one thing I will end this on, too, is I think it's important, as you read what's going on in the news and read about what's going on now politically, and we're seeing momentum, right? We're seeing progress. One of the criticisms is I am a woman and I don't think that I feel like I'm represented by the Women's March, coming even from the other side. And I say, come, please come. It's about women coming together and celebrating what we have done, but also continuing to realize that there's a lot of work in front of us, and you can be on the other side of the aisle. That doesn't matter. What matters is that we believe that there's still work that can be done. One topic, but we probably agree with 30 others. So with that, thank you.
So just so everyone knows, we're on Facebook Live, so since my husband's watching, my husband's parents also came in the 1970s from Bangalore, and so I resonate with that story. My name's Ty Gregory. I'm the executive director of A Wider Bridge. I just want to give a shout out to my staff and board members for volunteering tonight. Thank you. And we are proud to be in the trenches with Zioness. We need more progressive Zionist voices from different communities standing up for these incredibly important issues. I'm here to provide a case study from the LGBT community in our work at A Wider Bridge to think about when we're addressing these issues in the feminist movement. We are the LGBT rights organization advancing equality in Israel and equality for Israel. And we're living our progressive Zionist values by fighting for this part of our Jewish identities that we believe in, by walking our values every day. And we Palestinians, Orthodox Israelis who just really want to be who they are. for our values at the same time. And this movement here can do the same exact thing. I want to bring up a contemporary issue in our community, which is the issue happening in San Francisco at Manny's. Has anyone kept up with this story? So one of our mission alumni, we run missions for LGBT influencers to go to Israel. He used to work for Mark Zuckerberg's foundation and opened this incredible place called Manny's, which is a place for civil discourse in San Francisco, a city, to say the least, that's pretty politically charged. And outside of his doors are a group called QUIT, Queers United Against Israeli Apartheid, who every day are trying to stop people from coming in and patronizing his restaurant and his place for civil discourse. And to that I say that that is blatant anti-Semitism. They're calling him a gentrifying Zionist. Okay, they're trying to pit him as a Jewish leader in San Francisco against communities of color in a rapidly changing community, the Mission in San Francisco. That's anti-Semitic, to say that there's some underlying motivation that's not about what his cause is. This idea that somehow Jews are mischievous. And also, Manny is a descendant of Jews from Yemen. He is a Jew of color himself. And so to say that somehow he is at odds of different communities that exist in San Francisco trying to build a better future is incredibly inappropriate. And of course, the idea that there are folks out there trying to stop the fight for equality in Israel, that is homophobic, that is transphobic. To say that you're stopping the hopes and aspirations of LGBT people just because of the government that they live in, whether you agree or disagree with their actions. We don't hold Russian LGBT people to that standard. We don't hold Myanmar LGBT people to that standard. Why are you conflating the experiences of an LGBT community and the state that they live in? That is homophobic and that is transphobic. So what I want to say is this. Evan Wolfson, who's the founder of Freedom to Marry, talks about what worked well in the campaign for marriage equality. And it wasn't saying we deserve equal rights. It wasn't saying that we deserve the same legal status. It was about ourselves. I'm a son. I'm a mother. I'm an aunt. When we bring it to what we want, when we want the same things, as feminists, as LGBT people, as Zionists, when we talk about our own personal experiences, that's how we change hearts and minds. And so what I want to share is that each one of us are our own best advocates in these fights. Not about some theoretical big picture. Tell your stories. You can move the needle person by person and conversation by conversation. And we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Melanie Robbins, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Anti-Defamation League, New York, New Jersey. And so if you're not familiar with us, our work has been for over 100 years to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, secure justice, and fair treatment for all. Essentially, we fight hate. And a lot of that hate that I see that comes through my desk, through the cases that get reported, are across the spectrum of issues. And so I think a first point that we have to start to reckon with is that hate comes from so many different places and that there's no one ideological monopoly on what hate is. But what I also started to see is just the amount of rhetoric in which you were referring to before, that simply being a Jewish American, you are, this whole dual loyalty of your responsibility for everything and anything that happens. And so we see this on college campuses with students running for office and so forth. It's extremely disheartening and in fact, to a point, frightening to see to an extent what has happened in the discourse and rhetoric and the normalization of this type of conversation. But I come here today with that professional hat. I come here today also as a co-founder of a movement called My Voice, Our Future, which is exactly trying to do what you were just referencing here, is tell our stories. Because what I've learned through my process and having lived in Israel as well for 5 years and having worked, frankly, across the spectrum of issues and policy issues, I understood that the biggest thing that we were lacking was the willingness to stand up and be empowered in what we are and who we are and what we stand for. I think today in the Jewish community, we still haven't gotten on the same page as to what Zionism means, and we have to be loud and strong and proud of what that is, and each of us should be able to define, but that spectrum has to be welcome, and these voices have to be welcome just as much as we have to welcome other voices two tables. And so, as you were saying before as well, this is a personal journey that we each have to take upon ourselves to feel proud and empowered in our identity, in our connection to an ancestral homeland that, again, if you look at just frankly the platform issues of a movement like the BDS movement, there are inherent anti-Semitic components to that. Whether every individual is anti-Semitic or not is a different story. But to deny one group of people the right to self-determination while upholding the right to self-determination for another is inherently problematic. And so when you start to deconstruct some of these things, what we have to start focusing on is what is the essence of anti-Semitism today? And instead of just pointing out where, oh, this group is, it's just the white supremacists, right? It's just this type of anti-Semitism. We have to be vigilant everywhere we are, in every space that we operate, and recognize where that anti-Semitism is, where it's coming from, and where we may, on a personal level, be able to deconstruct that through meaningful and honest and open dialogue when that's possible. It may be making stronger actions and having to call out and say, this is crossed to a boundary that, like, you are personally offending me, and it's become an issue of bias. When you see students who are being pushed out of college campus, governments or resolutions being passed at times when, Jewish students aren't on campus, it's no longer, as you said before, about a political question. It's simply starting to identify people as a characteristic, and this characteristic is being used in a way to push us out of spaces. And there are a lot of Jews who say, no, this isn't the situation, you just haven't understood everything correctly. And many of those are the same people that I dialogue with, because frankly, I'm one of these people who sees myself as a convener. I cross a lot of lines, and we do need to keep those conversations open. We need to also reconcile with how do we show our allyship as we ask for that allyship. And I hope to have some more of these important conversations so that we can see a range of views represented at a unified women's movement, because as we all know, what wins is when they divide and conquer. And right now, we continue to divide, and so they're conquering, and our rights and our future are at risk, not only as Jewish Americans, but especially for someone who has, for many, many years, and sees the world through the lens, frankly, as a feminist. Like, our future as women are also completely under threat if we can't come together and find the ability to recognize each other for who and what we are, and be willing to dialogue about that and not define for each other what you should or shouldn't be. Because right now, that's what's happening, and we should be able to define for ourselves what we are, what we stand for, and we shouldn't be told that we have to check a piece of us at the door because it makes some uncomfortable. That's what true intersectional organizing would look like, and I hope that we can continue to achieve with movements here with the Women's March Alliance and all these incredible allies at the table. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Robin Fryer-Bodson. I self-identify as a progressive feminist Zionist, and I have been labeled that as well. I'm also an observant Jew, and I am a congregational rabbi who observes Shabbat in Queens. So I will not be marching on Saturday because logistically it's impossible. I have Oftentimes we think about Moses leading the people, but this week, rabbis all over who might not be able to march will lead their congregations and inspire them with two women. The first woman is Miriam. Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, she was one of our greatest leaders of all time, a little overshadowed by her brother. But she saved her brother as he went down the Nile. And even this week's Torah portion, when we read about this long, long song that Moses sings with all of the men, immediately she says, I'm involved too. And she takes up her tambourine and she makes music and she too sings, representing all of the women. All of you who march on Saturday, you will be Miriam, and you'll take that with you when you that we read about in the longest Haftorah of the year. And that is the prophetess Deborah, or Devorah. She's known right from the start as a judge, so she's a leader. She's a leader, and she sits under the palm tree in the shade because it's so hot all the time. And people came to her for advice, straight from the text, straight from the Midrash. Women have been in places of leadership from the beginning, and something happened that our voices were quieted. I encourage all of you on Saturday, the day of rest from everything else you're doing, to be present, to come together as an alliance, to come together as Zionists, and share your messages, because it's an important message that we all have. Women have always been leaders. Sometimes we need to find a little bit harder to find their voices, but look for them and become them as well.
I mean, I'm feeling so emotional already because you are all some of the most amazing people I've ever met and worked with, and I feel so privileged to have you here on the stage and to sit next to you. Yes, okay, so the first question I'm going to take the liberty of asking, even though I know Quentin already has a huge stack of questions over there. I know what it is because I know why we're all here. The first and primary reason that we organize these teach-ins is because the Jewish community has questions. How and when and where and why do we show up at the Women's March this weekend? And here in New York, it's a really easy answer for Zioness, and that's because of Catherine and Freedom and all the other people who are working on this march with the Women's March Alliance. And I know there's also confusion because there is now a counter protest of some sort, rally downtown, and nobody really understands the distinction between the DC leaders and the more local marches. And I'm getting the same questions every day, all the time, from people all over the country. How do we navigate this? What does it all mean? Who do I trust? Who do I march with? Who, in what city should I stay home? So I really want, I think I've made it very clear how I feel about New York, but I really want to give Catherine and Freedom the opportunity to explain how we got here and why it's so important that we march with Women's March Alliance. I will say, in my opinion, anyone who sets up a counter rally in the middle of the official Women's March in New York City, which had the largest Women's March in the country, that's not a real feminist. That's not someone who wants to advance the women's agenda. That's someone who wants to pull women away from the march where hundreds of thousands of women will be, talking about how we can come together and how we can advance our movement and the issues that matter to us. So I really hope that we will tell all of our friends. We will grab Zioness posters in the lobby. We will tell our daughters and our sisters and our mothers to march with us, to show up and to be proud of who we are and to talk about the issues that matter and to stand with extraordinary leaders like these women. So Catherine, if you don't mind.
So first, I know it's difficult. We host these marches on Saturday. There's a number of reasons. We're New York City. We have a lot of people traveling in. They travel in Friday night. So we actually host the march on the Upper West Side so that those communities on the Upper West Side can attend the march without violating Sabbath law. So it's a small concession, but it's one that we're attempting to make. We get a lot of, I thought when you said Queens, I was like, yeah, we get a lot of flack from them, but it's important to us that we have it so you can walk right in. What's missing from history is the perspective of women. I think that you mentioned that. You're not marching for Catherine Simianko. You're not marching for Women's March Alliance. You're marching for your daughters. You're marching for your granddaughters. You're marching to honor your mothers and your grandmothers who stood before you and said, women are equal. We deserve equal treatment. So don't come out for any reason other than the women you know and the women in the future generations that need to see that we have a voice. And when we had the opportunity to march, we took it. We didn't sit home. We took it. Freedom, do you want to say anything there? I think we'll get those questions. Well, that's why I asked. Okay. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I will say one thing, being here in New York, and I will admit, like the first year I actually went to DC. Me and some friends actually got in a van, drove down. We didn't care who was doing what, who the organizers were. It didn't matter. We just wanted to feel united and whole and not alone and like we were doing something, right? And this year we're obviously finding that there is a lot of question in terms of who we are, who they are. Mom of all people, and she says, and she lives in Phoenix, she's not here in New York, and she says, I am going to an event tonight, this was last night, I'm going to an event tonight, and one of the Women's March Inc. from DC was going to be there. So she's like, I will get back to you. But basically what it came down to, she calls me today and she says, here's my understanding, and I don't understand, is they want to do a march for women of color. And I literally just felt myself become enraged when I heard that. And I am a woman of color. I want to be very clear about this. I am a woman of color, but I want all women to come together for this. So when asking to yourself, like, which march do I go to? Where do I decide to go? Well, you can go to a march that's decided to, or a rally, it's not even a march, that has chosen to become decisive, that doesn't need to be, and I'm not saying that there isn't a time and a place sometimes, right? But this is not about that. It's not about color, it's about women coming together and men who want to march for the women in their lives.
So I'll ask one more quickly. All right, I've asked this at the other two teach-ins, and I just think it's a fascinating topic, and everyone doesn't need to answer because we'll be here until the march is over on Saturday. I know you guys have some places to be. I want to talk for a minute about intersectionality. It's the buzzword of the progressive space. Intersectionality is the buzzword of the progressive space. It's probably in that stack somewhere, this very question. Intersectionality in application has been divisive, and identity politics have been divisive and have put us all in silos where we're not working together and we're not advancing the movement because we have 2 women's marches in DC and because nobody knows whether they can trust the Women's March or whether it's anti-Semitic, and we are not talking about the issues that matter. Imposed on American Jews in the feminist movement and in progressive spaces are making American Jews stay home. And of all progressive movements from their inception. And when we're staying home, it's hurting the movements. So how do we of intersectional theory? Situation where a lot of communities feel unwelcome. Obviously, we're in a synagogue, so the primary community that I'm. Can we salvage intersectionality? And, in our broader conversations, both in the progressive community and outside of it, is there a way that we can reframe the conversation to include Jews? Realize that, for example, the Jewish community was targeted for our support of communities of color. And when they were chanting at Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, they didn't actually think that the number of Jews was ever going to outnumber white people in America. That's not possible. When they say Jews are not going to replace us, they're talking about the Jewish community's support for communities of color, for immigrants and refugees, and, and people don't realize that, and they don't realize that organizing principle of it's so important that our communities are coming together to break us apart and wants to hurt the movements that we care about, which when we're fighting together, we can move forward. So that's a concern with intersectionality. Having said that, of course, there are positives. It's important to empathize with people, to understand that people are facing different levels of harm and of discrimination. So, okay, I talked way longer than I wanted to. I just really want to know from all of you whether you think that we can reapply intersectionality in a way that does include the Jewish community, or whether you think we need a new theory.
I'm going to jump
No
because I don't see
pressure,
anyone else jumping right now, as I do have some background in women and gender studies. And so I would actually take a first jab at that and say that, frankly, I think the application of intersectionality as a philosophy or theory today is very distant from where it really came from. It was initially a paradigm to understand how different structures of oppression impact people because of the various parts of their personhood, right? And so what we see today is, frankly, two usages of the term. We see the kind of classic or attempt at the classic theory about how to understand the world and the experiences that people have. And then especially within the Jewish community and within progressive spaces, it's kind of become also a code word, if you will, for the growth and movement of like these BDS ideologies to say, if you believe X, then you are inherently at odds with Y, right? So if you are a Jewish woman and you believe in the state of Israel, you inherently somehow cannot understand the intersectional oppression of other women of color or Palestinian women or so forth. And this is a really flawed, A, interpretation of intersectionality. B, it sets up a discourse and paradigm, again, of a zero-sum game that you can only be for one part of that identity. And again, as I was saying before, somehow our identity is being defined for us, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so I would almost start pushing, I don't know that to say the theory itself is flawed, because it's a really important tool to understand how different forms of oppression work and what we need to break apart and how we need to be allies to each other in that process. But I think what the narrative and discourse around it has become is what's extremely problematic. And the more that we can disrupt that and say, first of all, like, we're not really using this, and what's really being said here is that certain types of Jews are just not welcome because of their, belief and, frankly, part of their identity. And so I think it's about changing its supposed, implementation, rather than there necessarily being a flaw with the theory. And I think that comes with a whole broader conversation about how do we address these discourse issues and intersectionality as a tool to break down systems of oppression without isolating and alienating certain parts of people's identity from all points of view.
I'll jump in. First, just to echo something that Ty said, is that when we have to show up and we have to bring our stories. I think those are two important parts. The other thing is I want to bring forth is something I learned about last year from Professor Willie Tolliver at Hunter's College for Social Work, who's an African American and teaches a lot about race and culture and tries to bridge between people. And he brought forth a theory of positionality that is dynamic, and that he spoke of himself as a professor, an African-American professor. When he sits in front of a classroom, he has a certain level, his position is at a certain level. When he's walking down the street as an African-American in jeans and a sweatshirt, different positionality. We Jews sitting in this beautiful synagogue in New York City in 2018 have a certain position. Well, a lot of us are very well off. Some of us, but not speaking for everybody, right? But take us back to the 40s in Germany, completely different level of position. And when we can talk about that and identify that we each have different positions in life, it just is the way society is set up. And when we can honor where our position is at that one time and try and be empathetic of someone else's position, trying to see where they are, then we can kind of untangle that and get rid of the black and white in both literal and metaphorical sense.
Very quickly, I think that we need to strive for intelligence when we approach these issues. It's wrong to lump together a bunch of different struggles without really understanding each one. Understanding the LGBT struggle, understanding the history of the Jewish people, and taking each one separately. And yes, we can all support each other in these different struggles, but to just have a more soundbite mentality, we don't really understand what we're saying, but just lump together a bunch of issues, I think is very harmful.
I think intersectionality is contrary to Jewish thought. In Jewish thought, we believe that we can hold multiple truths at once, and that we have multiple places in our heart to hold all of these multiple truths. People hear the word intersectionality now. First of all, they don't know what it means. Yeah. All they know is that extremely divisive people who get a lot of media coverage use it, so it must be how those people use it. And so they're, Amcha, the general population who haven't studied gender studies, hear this word, they think it's great. Autocorrect never gets it right for them when they text it to their friends. And then, when someone gets out there and says, you can't be a feminist and a Zionist, intersectionality is a theory, school, oh, it must be right. Well, it's just contrary to my belief system as a Jew.
I guess the question I would ask is, why do we have to concede the exclusionary understanding of intersectionality? Why not redefine it in the spirit of Dr. King, who said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? That we should not view our struggles in silos, but that we're bound together by a common humanity. That's a beautiful idea. The problem with the contemporary application of intersectionality is that it ignores the Jewish struggle for liberation, right? And what I propose is that we should not privilege the Jewish struggle for liberation over the Palestinian struggle, or privilege the Palestinian struggle over the Jewish struggle. We should treat both struggles with respect and dignity. That's a genuinely inclusive understanding of moral interdependence of intersectionality. So I would say redefine the term, because the BDS movement is quite skillful at weaponizing the language of human rights to discredit Israel. And so why should we concede their understanding of these terms? We should redefine it on our terms, on more inclusive terms.
This is the most interesting conversation on intersectionality I've ever had, and I've probably had one every day for a year and a half, so. Okay, what do you say, panelists, to those who maintain that keeping alliance with the Women's March, Inc. leadership is tshuva, an obligation, and an effort to effect authentic change? It's a hard one, but it's important. Who wants it?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. So for people who are standing by the leaders in DC, the co-chairs, I don't like to actually call them leaders because I think they're dividers. There are Jews who are standing with them who say we need a unified movement, and so they're standing with the people who they see as unifying. Hard to explain that, but I know it's true. What do you say to people who are not abandoning the DC march? And I will say it's important for people, I think probably a lot of you know this, but last weekend Emily's List formally disassociated from the DC Women's March. The Southern Poverty Law Center formally disassociated from the DC Women's March. The Democratic National Committee formally disassociated from the DC Women's March. So people are seeing leaders, corporate leaders, social leaders, organizational leaders understand that bigotry is bigotry and that we cannot march with bigots. So that's my answer to the question, but what's your answer, guys?
So I've been actually, a friend of mine forwarded me an article that made me think about this very question. I think there is always room for tshuva. There's always room for repentance and rethinking. And just as we don't want people to make a decision about what we have done and not let us grow and learn and understand, we shouldn't do that to others. So I applaud them for exploring and thinking about maybe intersectionality doesn't have to mean this. And the more that people think bigger, the better. And the people that they've been talking to are good thinkers and are passionate people who understand the Jewish people. So I think that that is very important, and we should encourage that. For me, what is problematic is the divisiveness. That because it's not just about the relationship to Jews, it's about the relationship with other people. And if you think that should be the only people in town and you should roll over others if they're not in line with you, then that's problematic. And when I hear that that is being rethought and thinking really about changing from being divisive and to say, okay, so this is my organization, there's another organization that's successful and another organization is successful. Wow, 3 organizations that are, or 4, whatever, that are successful, let's figure out how to work together and actually talk and listen to each other. That, I think, is more important, or the challenge that's there now.
My view is actually very simple. There is such a thing as right and wrong, and being hateful towards other people is wrong. So when that exists, I can't get behind it. I'm on the side of inclusivity, and that's why I'm here with the Alliance.
Sorry, I got the one mic down here. I just want to, make it clear. There are 600 individual sister march groups, right? So it's not Women's March Inc. or else. There are 600 groups. There's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? I mean, there are multiple leaders in these movements. And so I think it's wrong of us to say this or that. We are growing, we are moving, we are changing, and I'm hoping, I haven't seen it yet, I'm hoping that Tamika and Linda are learning, but I haven't seen that yet, so.
I would just want to echo that and say I think there's a big question here as to what kind of national vision do we want to have as a women's movement, and how do we get there, and what role does the grassroots play, and how do we interplay between institutions and a national movement who should be there, frankly, to be empowering those grassroots, leaders who brought our people out there, who were really the faces for our communities. And so I think there's a need to process and engage with what that really means to have an effective movement. And then, and I think, as you were saying, Rabbi, there are some very well-intentioned and very thoughtful people who have been part of that dialogue. And so I appreciate the fact that that dialogue is being had. I hope that we can expand that, because I think more voices need to be represented in a conversation there to see if there is a genuine willingness to actually engage, or if it is just, frankly, sound bites and kind of specific political opportunities. And so I think these are things yet to be determined, but should be on the top of our list, because when we lose the seat at the table, that's when we lose our voice. So, yeah.
I'm all for, dialogue and inclusion, and I think we should all keep an open mind. But it's been said that you can't keep your mind so open that your brains fall out, right? And we need to have non-negotiables, right? Growing up, people would say, "Tell me who your friends are, and I can tell you who you are." And we're judged by the people we associate with, right? And I remember having a conversation with my chief of staff, because I'm worried about the growing influence of the BDS movement on the left, and I consider myself a member of the left. I made it clear to my chief of staff that I will never seek the endorsement of an organization that supports BDS, whose platform, right, I think the objective effect of whose platform is the destruction of Israel as we know it, right? That should be a non-negotiable. So I think it's fair to say I'm all for dialogue, but I also have non-negotiables by which I live.
If I may kindly be excused, I know what are the questions are coming. I can feel it. I can see all of you gracefully, the passion, the compassion in this room. We have to think, who am I? I'm a human being. I came here empty-handed, and I'm going back empty-handed. So when I'm going back, what I'm leaving here, I am trying to leave a better world for my children and their grandchildren. When I think that no matter whether it is a women march, no matter it is a LGBT, no matter it is what it is, we will come all united. There is a saying, 1,000 candles can be lighted from a single candle, and yet the life of that candle cannot be shortened or will not be shortened. And when happiness, shares, being shares, it never decreases. So we have to think whether we are going to leave this world for our children, grandchildren better. Yes, indeed. Our difference does not matter because we think differently, but at the end, we are all united in human being. We care and share. Thank you very much.
I just want to give a different answer to it. You know, the Talmud is hundreds and hundreds of pages of arguments and disagreements. And so there's one person says one way and another person says the other way, or one rabbi says one way and the other rabbi says the other way, and someone always wins at the end, but the other voice is recorded. If I was in a conversation or a dialogue or a machloket with people from the Women's March Inc., I would just simply disagree with them. They have a space, but I'm going to firmly disagree with those who are aligning with them.
Okay, so someone wrote, and I think this is interesting, please explain again why there is a perceived issue with being both a Zionist and a feminist. And I think it's a good question because it's absurd. So maybe someone can explain where it comes from, the suggestion that you can't be both, and I'm happy to explain why Zionists exist because it's in response to that. But if anyone wants to take that one, yeah.
So I think this is all about language and defining ourselves first. Those of you in politics, Richie, you probably relate to this. You want to define yourself instead of let someone else define you. And so for the LGBT community, not so long ago, people used to label us as queers, right? They would throw that in our faces on the street. It was a derogatory term. And those of us in the millennial generation and the Generation Z are now using this term to reclaim it for ourselves. We are the queer community. Sometimes it's a catch-all term, sometimes it's a way to describe ourselves as gender or sexually non-binary, but we've reclaimed that term. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and others made liberal a dirty word, and we allowed that to define who we were. And we are now redefining ourselves as proud liberals, along with everything that goes with that. But somehow we've allowed folks who don't identify as Zionists and don't identify as feminists define what those things mean for us. Zionism is equated with apartheid or genocide. That's absolutely ridiculous. Zionism is a yearning for the security and the homeland of the Jewish people, like any other peoples. And feminism is about equality. Yet we continue to see people use it in a derogatory manner in this backlash from this Gillette ad, which is pretty funny, in my opinion, to see the backlash. That's exactly what they wanted to provoke, and they got it. So we need to reclaim these terms for ourselves. Don't let anyone tell you who you are.
Anybody else? Okay. So I'm going to quickly say Zionist exists as a direct response to the suggestion that you cannot be both a Zionist and a feminist. It is an outrageous suggestion. It is blatantly wrong. Most American Jews, and by most I mean the vast majority, something like 93%, identify as Zionist. There has been a loud and very small minority of people who are saying they are the anti-Zionist Jews that are representing the Jewish community, and we as a community have not unified behind the basic principle that Zionism is inherent to the identity of the Jewish people. We pray toward Israel. We say next year in Jerusalem at every holiday. The religious among us say Shema Yisrael 3 times a day. Shema Yisrael. It is so part of who we are as a people that you can't open a prayer book. I don't see any, I'm sure there are some in this place. You can't open a prayer book without finding Zion on the page that you open it to. The people of Israel, the land of Israel. So we need to reclaim the term for sure, but we need to be talking about it as what it really is because, as Ty said, we have let other people define it for us, and we have let people suggest that if you are anti-Zionist, you are not anti-Semitic, and that it is, political discourse, political criticism of a state. I know somebody mentioned this before. You can criticize Israel as much as you want. Do it the same way you would criticize the United States, because I do that every single day. That is completely fine. That is welcome, in fact, and on this table, we could have a raging debate on all sorts of issues, but we can unite behind the belief that the Jewish people are entitled to a homeland, which we need for protection, and which is honestly a beacon
who you are and that that's who your people are, that we are committed both to domestic progressive values, to social justice, to human dignity and equality for all people, and also we are committed to the self-determination of the Jewish people, our people. Those are identities that go hand in hand. They belong together, they work together. And beyond that, Zionism is the original progressive movement. It is a movement for the world's most enduring persecuted community. And we've been largely successful in the manifestation of the Zionist dream. We have a state, it is safe and secure. We've also learned a lot of lessons about what it means to fight for self-determination. And we have an understanding of how hard it can be. I know that the racial justice movement learned a lot from Zionism and vice versa. That's why we've been such natural allies all this time. And I think it's important that we talk about that more, that we talk about what Zionism means to us as Jewish people. That's how we reject the narrative that you can't be a Zionist and a progressive. So if that's how you feel, I hope you'll join Zioness.
Okay, next question. How do we make Israel a bipartisan issue? And then sort of the same question as before, how do we deal with amazing female leaders who have come out strongly against Israel and are pro-BDS? We want to support female leadership, but at what point does support become sacrifice? So,
Repeat the first part of the question.
I thought it was one question, but it's actually two. How do we make Israel a bipartisan issue?
Israel is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
I've been very involved in AIPAC for many, many years, and that's everything that they do is do everything they can to make sure that Israel is and remains a bipartisan issue.
I would say also when we are standing proudly as Zionists in progressive spaces, we are making sure the world knows that the left is committed to Israel. So it's important that that narrative change because, again, there is a very loud but very small community of people who are trying to destroy the left's support for Israel. There are also people on the right who are politicizing Israel and turning it into an issue that if you support it, you have to be on the political right. That is just as problematic as what's happening on the left. So it's on all of us to make sure that if we support Israel, we're talking about it in our progressive circles. We're talking about it when we are at the Women's March. Not to constantly talk about the politics and policies of Israel, but to talk about our belief that support for it is a progressive value.
I just want to add that we had a number of firsts to celebrate with this new Congress landscape. You have Jared Polis, who's the first gay governor in America. It's a big accomplishment. But amongst the new Congress is the first Palestinian American woman elected to Congress. And that's also something that we should celebrate. And this is a message to the pro-Israel community, the Jewish community. We have to celebrate that achievement. We have to celebrate more women of color in Congress and Arab women of color in Congress. We need to disagree on policy, not people. And if we have a concrete discussion about our policy disagreements with her and a small handful, let's keep it in perspective, it's a small minority handful who support the boycott movement, we can keep it civil and understand that we respect who they are and their accomplishments without turning what should be an important effort to secure a bipartisan relationship and have it backfire on our community. Let's celebrate everyone.
There is a difference between a layperson and the head of the states. When a layperson stands and says that I don't believe your history and you have no right, you just ignore. But when a state, head of the state says that you have no right to exist and I annihilate you, that is a dangerous thing. That is sowing the seeds of hate. They are denying, the head of the state is denying Holocaust, denying the sovereignty of a state. You may not agree with the government. Government comes and goes, but the state stays. Whether it is Israel or America, you have to salute the states. So you have to think, when that bigotry comes from a head of the states, where we comes and hold the hand like that, and you say, if you come to my Jewish sister, come to me first as a Muslim one, and I will see how you can say the Jewish state will not exist. Thank you.
So I'm curious if we can talk for a moment about how solidarity is a two-way street.
because we in the Jewish community have been asking for the last 2 years who will stand with us in the face of rising anti-Semitism on both sides. And I see here a lot of allies for our community, a lot of people who have stood with us. And again, we did these teach-ins in Los Angeles and Washington already, and there were extraordinary allies with us there too. There are allies everywhere if we look for them and we ask for them to show up for us. But again, it is a two-way street. And I've seen with some of the allies who have been very courageous standing with our community that we have taken every opportunity where every conversation is about fighting BDS and everything we want to talk about is somehow related to anti-Semitism. And that's a problem too. So how can we find ways to work together where, we are supporting each other? It's not a one-way street. We can't ask for people to stand with us when we're not standing with them back. So how do we do that? What does it look like? What does the activism that goes both ways look like?
So here's my opinion, and it goes along with what was just mentioned, is you stick with policy, right? Because if you look at women not being paid the same as men, it doesn't matter. That's across the board. It doesn't matter what area you tend to work in. It doesn't matter your religion. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. We are not paid equally, right? So I feel like if you stick with issues, then hopefully we can all come together versus being divided. And how do we support each other?
I want us to take a step backward, not about how do we do it, but how do we think about it. I had the privilege to meet one of my heroes and listen to him speak, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the UK, who I long admired for his wisdom and his ability to communicate the love of all humanity. And he spoke about some of the successful ways that he's worked with the British government to support Israel and to support the Jewish community. And he said the way that he did it was to show up at every single place where other communities needed support. The Muslims needed support, he was there. He brought the Jewish community with him. And we're often talking about, well, what about we are in his life, and we talk Jews who brought up civil rights and work with the community. Yes, but we still need to do that, and we need to do that at every single opportunity. And when we focus on other people, and this is true about interpersonal relationships along with community relationships, when we focus on others and their needs and taking care of them, they will take care of us. We won't need to worry about taking care of us because others will be worrying about taking care of us.
I want to make the question just a tiny bit more explicit. In some of the progressive spaces that we really want to be active in, we feel pushed out. So, for example, when Trump announced the refugee ban and everyone was protesting at the airports, everyone there was waving Palestinian flags and talking about BDS. And at Standing Rock, at the protest at Standing Rock about the Dakota Access Pipeline, everyone was waving Palestinian flags and talking about indigenous people. And we actually have a board member, Erin Schrody, who was shot with a rubber bullet. She's fine. But she put aside, she crossed lines, as Melanie said. She put aside the fact that this was a direct attack on her identity because she wanted to stand at Standing Rock for the Sioux. She's very courageous. With a rubber bullet. When we are being targeted in that space. So how do we get past, and it goes to the intersectionality question and a lot of what we've talked about already, but how do we build the bridges back? I think the Jewish community is selfish. We've been on the forefront of these issues, and everyone has said, and at all three teach-ins and in all my conversations, everyone has said the Jewish community has always been there working to advance social justice and civil rights for all communities. So how do we address the fact that we're feeling pushed out? How do we get back those relationships to advance the movements?
So, if I may, this is something that, especially in the work that I do, I take a lot of intentionality about not only thinking about, but making sure that we show up. I think it's one thing to think about how we show up, but it's almost before you even show up, you need to have the conversation to know when and how to show up. And I think, we do say that, we look back at our history and we say, we've been there, we've been there, we've been there. Like ADL was part of Brown v. Board. We helped demask the Ku Klux Klan, right? Like we've been there, but at some point, we lost those relationships. We weren't at the table when the BLM platform was put out, right? Because it would have never said what it did. We weren't at a lot of tables, and a lot of that has led at local levels and at national levels. And yes, our national organization works in coalition with broad range of diverse, civil rights organizations as well. But when I came to New York and started the role that I did, I understood that it had been a long time since people just were willing to sit down and listen, really actively listen about what was happening in their community, what were the needs that they had, and then from that glean an understanding as to how they can be an ally due to their positionality, and vice versa. So I mentioned before, I'm a co-founder of this campaign called My Voice, Our Future. It's co-founded with a Muslim Sudanese activist, and he's an incredible guy. And oftentimes, he can use his positionality, frankly, to say things that I could never say, nor would anyone ever really hear from me. But because of our working relationship, we're able to show up for each other in different spaces and represent for each other in spaces that neither of us would have necessarily had the privilege to be able to be in. So I think it's a lot about relationships. It's understanding the needs and then truly showing up, not when it's just about, a lot of what we do is dealing with hate crimes, right? So there's a press rally, there's a response and all these things, but then it's a black church or it's a mosque and you have a couple of folks there, maybe some of the elected officials show up, but frankly, it's really hard to convene. And so there is this feeling still out in the street that, we show up when the Jewish community calls, but they don't show up when we call. And so that's a process of relationship building, of active listening and understanding. And I think going back to the positionality piece is what do we bring and where do we find that common ground, not only on our values and even if we have to disagree on political issues, but like what is it happening in the here and now that we can work together on, and how can we bring what we have to that struggle?
And I think, thank you for asking the question so explicitly, Amanda. And I think that the answer is exactly what you are doing with Zioness. It's when you're pushed out of a space, create your own space, and then make it a bigger space. When I look at the diversity of this panel, it gives me a lot of hope, because what we're doing is redefining intersectionality, as we talked about. So let's grow Zioness, and I'm here to support Zioness in every way I can, as we all are, and we're eager to hear about bigger ways that we can support Zioness.
I want to expand on that. A lot of us are familiar with Rabbi Hillel's quote, which is, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not, now when?" There's a structural issue in our Jewish community right now. We have institutions that support the Jewish community and protect Israel that don't have a mandate on their boards and in their mission statements around issues of social justice. And we have social justice institutions in our Jewish community that disagree on Israel and other issues related to it that don't have a mandate about supporting Israel. And as we've seen over the past decade, those two subsets of our community aren't talking to each other, aren't working with each other, and don't see eye to eye. And so the work that we're trying to do at A Wider Bridge and the work of Zioness is saying, we refuse to choose. We're going to do both of these things. We're going to stand up for social justice. We're going to stand up for Israel. And it's so important we're having these discussions and building the movements that we need to protect our communities and to protect all the other communities we care so deeply about.
Okay, so I think we're out of time. I just want to thank you all so much again for coming. And to all of you, I really, this has been so enlightening, so inspiring. You're all so amazing. You're all doing amazing work every day. And to take your time here tonight to help teach about how we can make a better America, a better women's movement, a better LGBTQ movement, a better progressive movement. I hope we all walk away with some new inspiration and some new hope. And also, I hope to see all of you at the Women's March on Saturday. Zioness will be meeting outside the Beacon Theater at 9:15 on Broadway between 74th and 75th. Take your posters. We'll have more posters there. And Rabbi Debbie Bravo will be giving an invocation at, I think, 9:30. But anyway, be there and don't miss it. It's going to be amazing. And this is how we have to show up. That's really the takeaway that I want all of you to have tonight, because we've asked for leaders like Catherine and Freedom, and we have them. So let's stand with them, let's empower each other, and let's move the women's movement forward.
And on behalf of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, thank you so much to all of our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much to Zioness. Thank you, Women's March Alliance. And we look forward to joining you on Saturday. And thank you all so much for being here with us, and for all Stephen Wise members, social justice teams who are involved in this, and to our social justice program associate, Daniel Lieberman, somewhere here. Thank you so much for your work on this, and for Ryan
Thank you, Daniel.
Grease on his work on this, and the whole Stephen Wise staff. One last thing, on January 28th, we are having a panel on BDS at college campuses. Please join us for that. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Now we can be officially friends.